Long before cities rose from stone and kings carved their names into history, before the first plough tilled the soil or the wheel began to turn, humanity existed in a quieter, wilder world, a world where survival was a daily rhythm and the stars were the only map. Let us drift far back into the depths of time, to 100,000 years ago, during the age we now call the Paleolithic. In this vast ancient era, the world was raw and untamed, filled with great beasts, endless forests, open savannas, icy tundras, and deep, hidden caves that sheltered the earliest expressions of our kind. These were the days of early Homo sapiens, our ancestors who lived not in concrete and steel, but in the heartbeat of nature. Their stories were not written in books, but etched into stone, whispered in firelight, and passed down through generations like a song carried by the wind. Imagine the scent of damp earth, the flicker of a fire in a darkened cave, and the steady rhythm of flint being struck to spark life into dry grass. These were the sounds and senses of the Paleolithic, a time when every day was shaped by the hunt, by migration, by the changing seasons, and the subtle signals of the land. The people of this time were few in number, scattered across continents, yet they were deeply connected to one another, to the animals they tracked, and to the cycles of nature they depended on. Their tools were simple but effective, shaped by flint knapping and bone carving, crafted with knowledge passed down by elders who had seen many winters. Their families, bound not by houses or property, but by shared survival, roamed in small groups, moving with the herds and settling where food and shelter allowed. They understood the language of birds, the meaning of fresh tracks in the mud, the warning in a sudden silence from the trees. They lived without clocks, but knew the rhythms of time through the arc of the sun and the dance of constellations overhead. These people, though separated from us by 100 millennia, were not so different in their dreams and fears. They loved, grieved, sang, and danced. They painted their stories onto cave walls with ochre and charcoal, leaving behind delicate handprints like soft echoes of their presence. They crafted beads and figurines, tiny ornaments perhaps worn for luck, identity, or sacred ritual. They learned to tame fire, not just for warmth and cooking, but for protection and community. Around fire, language flourished. Perhaps the first songs were sung here, lullabies for restless children or chants for the hunt. The Paleolithic was not a time of aimless wandering, but of deep knowledge and adaptation. Whether in the rolling grasslands of Africa, the harsh steppes of Ice Age Europe, or the jungles and forests of Asia, people learned to live with the land. They tracked mammoths and reindeer, fished in cold streams, gathered berries and roots, and used every part of an animal they brought down. Meat for food, hide for shelter, bones for tools, sinew for cord. Their footprints are fossilized in riverbeds and volcanic ash, preserved in places like Laetoli and Olduvai, silent testimony to their journeys. Their bones rest in caves and burial sites, often arranged with care, suggesting rituals and a belief in something beyond death. A spiritual dimension to life, however primitive. We find them across the globe, each group a reflection of its unique environment. In Europe, Homo sapiens shared the land with Neanderthals, competing and sometimes mixing. In Africa, the cradle of humanity, early modern humans thrived in savannas, woodlands, and coastal areas. In Asia, new frontiers were explored, paths carved through thick jungle and across high plains. Migration was not a choice but a necessity. driven by climate, game, and survival. The last ice age was creeping across the world, reshaping ecosystems, lowering sea levels, and opening new land bridges. Humanity responded by spreading out, step by cautious step, generation by generation, adapting along the way. Their bodies were lean and strong, shaped by endurance and movement. Their minds were sharp, capable of abstract thought, planning, memory, and invention. Even their sense of beauty and pattern was emerging, visible in carved bones, shell necklaces, and ochre-stained cave walls. What was life like really, for them? It was a life lived close to the bone and the breath, where each day brought the promise of awe and the threat of peril. They would wake with the sun, feeling the cold bite of morning, perhaps starting with foraging or scouting the perimeter for signs of danger. Women often gathered plants and roots, skilled in the knowledge of what healed and what harmed. Men might scout game trails, reading the land with practiced eyes. Elders shared stories, taught skills, and tended the young. Children played with sticks and stones, mimicking their elders and learning by doing. Fire was central, a hearth, a gathering place, a symbol of safety in a dark and often unforgiving world. There were no written records, yet knowledge flowed richly through oral tradition. Everything known, how to track an animal, how to find clean water, how to set a snare or birth a child, was learned through experience and passed down through demonstration, repetition, and story. In many ways, Paleolithic humans lived with a kind of wisdom we have since forgotten, a deep ecological awareness that came not from textbooks but from necessity. To misread a storm, to overlook a predator, or to consume a poisonous root could mean death. So they watched, they listened, they learned. Over time, they built mental maps of their world, where berries grew sweetest, which caves flooded in spring, where elk gathered to rut, when birds migrated. They became masters of timing, of camouflage, of cooperation. In their world, cooperation wasn't optional. It was the glue that held bands together. Disputes were dangerous, for there were no prisons, no courts. Harmony meant survival. So perhaps they mediated with stories, with shared rituals, with laughter around the fire. Perhaps their songs were lullabies for more than children, a way to soothe the soul in a vast, mysterious world. Even without agriculture, their lives had rhythm, migratory cycles, moon phases, animal behavior. There was likely a spiritual element to this rhythm, a sense of awe towards the sun, the moon, the stars, and the animals they hunted. Some carved figures suggest fertility worship, while burial sites hint at beliefs in an afterlife. Did they speak to the dead? Did they dream of gods or spirits? We do not know, but we can imagine. And in imagining, we draw closer to them. They likely gathered at night beneath open skies, watching the stars blink into life above them, their eyes following patterns long forgotten by modern minds. Perhaps they gave names to the constellations, imagined stories in their shapes. Hunters, beasts, spirits, ancestors, woven into the sky like an eternal tapestry. The stars may have served as guides across vast, unmarked lands, or as reminders of time passing, of seasons shifting, of loved ones gone. As the fire crackled and threw shadows against rock walls, elders may have spoken of the first hunt, the great beast, the origin of fire, or the cycle of birth and death. Myths and legends would have grown in that glowing ring of warmth, binding the tribe with shared meaning, with identity deeper than any tool. Life was harsh, yet the bonds of kinship were strong, And from this shared struggle came tenderness, compassion, and the earliest roots of empathy. When a member of the group fell ill or was injured, others tended to them, sharing food and care. Evidence of this kindness has been found in ancient skeletons with healed injuries that would have required long-term support. Even then, there was a sense of community that transcended the self, a web of mutual reliance that allowed not just survival, but life with dignity. In the cold north, people huddled in caves or built shelters from mammoth bones and hides, braving brutal winters with fire, furs, and each other's warmth. Their tools were adapted to the environment: ice scrapers, tailored clothing, spears tipped with bone or flint. In warmer regions, people lived more nomadically, following herds and gathering seasonal fruits. Palm fibers, reeds, and bark were woven into baskets, mats, or rudimentary shelters. Across all environments, the intelligence and flexibility of Homo sapiens shone through, innovating not just to survive, but to improve. Evidence of early art, ornamentation, and symbolic thinking appears even here. Red ochre used to stain the body or mark objects. Perforated shells worn as necklaces. Geometric patterns carved into stone or bone. These weren't just tools for survival, they were expressions of identity, of belonging, of a mind reaching beyond the present moment. A spiral etched into a cave wall might have represented water, a path, a cycle, or a story. Each mark was a signpost in a world alive with meaning. And as they moved across continents, early humans left behind not just artifacts, but echoes of themselves. Fingerprints in ancient clay, footprints in volcanic ash, bone tools buried beside the remains of their makers. In South Africa's Blombus Cave, ochre-stained stones bear crosshatch designs that may be among the earliest symbolic marks made by our species, dating back over 70,000 years. In Europe, the walls of Chauvet and Lascaux bear hauntingly beautiful images of horses, lions, mammoths, and bison, painted with natural pigments in flickering torchlight. Images not just of survival, but of reverence, imagination, and perhaps longing. The painters may have sung as they worked, accompanied by rhythms tapped on bones or drums. These were not crude or simplistic people. They were thoughtful, emotional, creative. As the climate shifted and glaciers advanced or retreated, populations moved again and again. Some groups vanished, others adapted, others interbred. The history of humanity is not a straight line, but a braided river of branches and crossings, with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other archaic humans contributing to our DNA. Some genes carried by modern people trace back to these encounters, particularly in Eurasia, where small bands of Homo sapiens met and mingled with the Neanderthals who had long called Europe home. These weren't always violent clashes. Some were surely peaceful, even intimate. The story of humanity is not one of endless war, but of exchange, cooperation, and learning. Neanderthals, once depicted as brutish and slow, are now understood as sophisticated beings, with their own tools, culture, and possibly even art. They buried their dead, used pigments, crafted ornaments, and may have taught or learned from Homo sapiens. Across the millennia, as glaciers waxed and waned, the great migrations continued. From Africa into the Middle East, through the Levant, into Europe, across Asia, down into Southeast Asia, and eventually to Australia by sea. Each journey required planning, courage, and trust. Every crossing of a river or mountain range marked a gamble, a risk for the chance of something better. And with each step forward, humanity evolved. not just biologically, but socially, emotionally, spiritually. In many places, humans encountered megafauna, massive mammoths, woolly rhinos, saber-toothed cats, giant sloths, marsupial lions. These creatures, sometimes dangerous, often awe-inspiring, were hunted with strategy and care. The mammoth, for instance, provided meat, hide, bone, and sinew, all parts of its body used, none wasted. Groups may have worked together to drive them into pits or ambush points, using fire, noise, and coordination. These were not random acts of desperation, but highly organized efforts rooted in deep knowledge of animal behavior. Children grew up learning these skills, not in classrooms, but through mimicry, storytelling, trial, and participation. A child might learn how to shape a flint edge by watching their parent, or how to stalk prey by playing hide and seek among the trees. They would grow up immersed in a world where everything was a lesson. The weather, the plants, the stars, the sounds of the forest. At night, under the stars, songs may have been sung not only for comfort, but as a form of memory, passing down knowledge of migration routes, plant uses, or sacred places. These oral traditions, though invisible now, may have been the lifeblood of early culture. A story sung could span generations, a melody remembered across lifetimes. Perhaps each group had a guardian of such knowledge, a storyteller, a singer, a shaman, who held the past in their voice and ensured it lived on. Rituals would have marked important events: birth, coming of age, death. A young hunter's first successful kill might be celebrated with chants and paint. A birth greeted with herbs, warmth, and gifts from the group. A death mourned with symbolic items buried beside the body. A tooth, a painted stone, a shell from a distant shore. These were not meaningless gestures. They reflected deep feelings, a growing sense of the sacred. And so, the Paleolithic continued, age after age, generation after generation, as people moved, lived, and adapted in ways both small and great. They built no empires, carved no monuments, but they created the foundation for all that would follow. Their legacy is not in ruins, but in the very fact that we are here, alive, descendants of those who survived by skill, by bond, by vision. Theirs was a life of movement and mindfulness, a life lived with the land rather than over it. They walked where we now build, drank from streams we now dam, gazed at stars we now map with telescopes. They are not just ancestors, they are us, wearing a different skin, speaking a different tongue, but dreaming dreams just as deep. As millennia passed in silence, the bones of ancient people settled into the soil, their lives fading into myth and memory. Yet their footprints remained, not just in the earth, but in the minds and bodies of their descendants. Each generation carried forward the lessons of the last, shaping the course of humanity, not through written law, but through remembered rhythm, repeated motion, handed down tools, and quietly sung lullabies. The world itself was the classroom, the guide, and the temple, and it was vast and ever-changing. Ice expanded and retreated in slow, grinding waves, reshaping coastlines, turning forests into deserts and deserts into savannas. Seas fell and rose, exposing dry land bridges across continents where the ancestors wandered with cautious hope. Herds of great beasts moved in seasonal cycles across these new lands, and where the herds went, people followed. Over thousands of years, this quiet migration carried humans farther and farther from their African birthplace, step by step across Eurasia, down through the dense forests of India, around the humid rivers of Southeast Asia, and eventually across open water to the shores of Australia. A leap so immense that it stands as a testament to the courage and creativity of early seafarers, whose names are long forgotten, but whose journey changed the world. They may have crossed by raft, hugging coastlines and island hopping, using stars and seabirds as guides. What drove them? Curiosity, hunger, exile, or simply the pull of the unknown? We may never know, but they went, and they found new lands teeming with life unfamiliar and untamed. On these new continents, the rules of survival shifted again. In Australia, enormous creatures known as megafauna roamed: giant wombats called diprotodons, towering kangaroos, fearsome marsupial lions, and massive flightless birds taller than any human. In this alien world, people quickly adapted, developing tools and techniques suited to the terrain. They learned to read the signs of fire, the tracks of sand, the whispers of wind across grass. Across other regions, humans met with different challenges. In the dense jungles of South Asia, the canopy formed a living ceiling where light filtered green and the air hung heavy with moisture. Here, hunters learned stealth and patience, the knowledge of poisonous plants, and the difference between the rustle of a monkey and the slither of a snake. In the mountainous lands of Central Asia, thin air and icy winds demanded new kinds of endurance, and people wrapped themselves in animal skins, sheltered in stone hollows, and developed techniques to store food through the harsh months. Meanwhile, back in Africa, innovation flourished. People there experimented with new types of tools, refining their hand axes, crafting barbed harpoons, and developing long-range weapons like the atlatl, a spear thrower that multiplied human strength and allowed for safer hunting. With every region, every new environment, humanity's understanding of the world deepened. Knowledge wasn't just passed down, it evolved, shaped by observation and intuition, success and mistake. And along with that evolution came something else: the rise of imagination, of creativity, of meaning projected into objects and spaces. Deep in the limestone caves of France and Spain, the evidence of this growing inner world survives in remarkable paintings. Lions with manes flowing in ochre, galloping horses rendered with such motion and grace they seem almost alive, handprints in negative space where someone, tens of thousands of years ago, placed their hand and blew pigment through a hollow reed, leaving a ghostly echo of presence on stone. These were not idle doodles, they were ritual, story, memory. Perhaps they honored the animals that fed them. Perhaps they asked the spirits for success in the hunt. Perhaps they were part of rites of passage or symbols of identity, or simply an explosion of feeling too big to contain. In the same caves, archaeologists have found arranged stones, burned out torches, and signs that people return to these sacred places again and again. Even in darkness, they brought light and meaning. In other parts of the world, similar marks appeared: in Indonesia, in South Africa, in Australia, suggesting that this impulse to express, to decorate, to symbolize, was not unique to one place, but woven into humanity itself. Alongside this visual art, music likely flourished. Flutes made from bird bones have been discovered, tuned to pentatonic scales still used in music today. Percussion instruments, drums of stretched hide, wooden clappers, hollow logs, would have echoed through forests and valleys. The beat of rhythm binding the group together, guiding dance, marking time. Language, too, must have flourished by this time. Though we cannot hear their voices, linguistic theory suggests that complex spoken language was likely in use by 100,000 years ago or earlier, passed along in the breath and sound of countless generations. Through language, they named the world, the trees, the rivers, the stars. Through language, they taught and teased, warned and welcomed. Through language, they wove webs of relationship and memory, creating identity that was shared and carried. A grandmother teaching a child to shape flint or remember the signs of approaching rain did so not just with gestures, but with words, words wrapped in song and story. And it's in language that perhaps we find the true heart of Paleolithic life, not just surviving, but connecting. In this ancient tongue, now lost but once spoken around fires under a sky of infinite stars, the foundations of everything we now take for granted were being laid. Every whisper of love, every story of a heroic hunt, every lullaby sung to calm a frightened child. These were the roots of civilization, still buried deep within us. The world of 100,000 years ago was quieter than ours in some ways, louder in others. The roar of mammoths, the crack of thunder over endless plains, the howls of wolves in the night. It was a world where every sound mattered, where listening could save your life or lead you to food. It was a world where children grew up, knowing the calls of birds and the taste of different roots, where fear and wonder walked hand in hand. In such a world, love too must have flourished. The need to belong, to touch, to protect and nurture. It didn't begin with agriculture or houses. It began here, in the Paleolithic, when someone stayed behind to care for the injured, when a father watched the stars with his son and whispered the names of constellations, when a mother smeared ochre on her child's cheeks and sang of the moon. These were not simple people. They were rich in memory, in tradition, in experience. They lived in a time where nothing was wasted, where every part of an animal was honored, where nature was not background scenery, but the very fabric of existence. And yet, as the millennia passed, humanity was already sowing the seeds of change. Stone tools grew more refined. Spears gave way to bows. Shelters became more complex. The earliest traces of long-term seasonal settlements appeared, often near rivers or along coastlines where fish and game were plentiful. These were not yet villages, but they hinted at the future, of staying, of returning, of marking a place as home. Fire pits became communal centers. Graves became more elaborate, sometimes with items clearly placed with care. A tool, a shell, a carved figure, suggesting ritual, remembrance, perhaps belief in a world beyond this one. In all of this, the art, the tools, the rituals, we see the blossoming of something profound. Humanity was not merely surviving in the Paleolithic. It was growing, imagining, creating. It was laying the foundation for everything that would come. We often look back and see the Paleolithic as a time of darkness, of primitive struggle. But in truth, it was a time of light. It was the dawn of thought, of spirit, of connection. And that dawn, stretching across thousands of years, is still with us. In the way we dream, the way we mourn, the way we tell stories, we are still Paleolithic, still walking with our ancestors across the endless plains of memory. And so the world turned slowly, subtly, shaping and being shaped by those early humans who walked its surface with bare feet and watchful eyes, whose thoughts were as deep as the shadows cast by firelight on cave walls, and whose spirits were already tethered to dreams they could not yet name. Across vast grasslands and icy ridges, along sun-drenched coasts and thick green jungles, People kept moving, always searching, always learning. Their movement wasn't aimless. It was guided by memory, instinct, and careful attention to patterns. They noticed when the berries ripened earlier than usual, when the herds changed direction, when the birds began their migration. These early people didn't need calendars. They carried time in their bones, in the stories told at dusk, in the rhythm of their footsteps across ancient trails. They lived not outside nature, but within it, a part of its cycles, its noise and silence, its fury and grace. To them, the world was alive in every breath and every shadow. A rock could hold memory. A tree might whisper. A pool of water could be a doorway between this world and another. Their world wasn't cluttered with noise, but it was filled with presence. A rich tapestry of scents, textures, movements, and sounds that formed a kind of living language, spoken not in words alone, but in gestures, feelings, and symbols drawn in earth and smoke. Across time, their tools became more refined, no longer just sharp stones or pointed sticks, but complex instruments with specific purposes: microliths for slicing, bone needles for stitching, finely balanced blades for butchering or carving. Hafting was invented, the joining of different materials, stone and wood, bone and sinew, to create tools that were stronger, more versatile. This idea of combining, of assembling, of building from parts was the beginning of a mindset that would eventually lead to architecture, machines, and cities. But even then, in that simple ingenuity, there was brilliance. To fix a broken spear, to wrap a cord just right, to carve a hook from bone, all these were acts of quiet mastery, passed from hand to hand, from generation to generation. And through this constant shaping of objects, early humans were also shaping themselves. Their minds became more organized, more curious. They began to plan, to anticipate, to imagine futures that hadn't yet come to pass. The brain of Homo sapiens was not only wired to survive, but to dream. And those dreams found form in the earliest art, the earliest adornments, the earliest rituals. In some places, the dead were laid to rest with careful arrangements, bodies placed in specific positions, accompanied by red ochre, tools, or beads. These acts suggest not only grief, but belief, belief in memory, in spirit, in continuity beyond the body. Perhaps they saw the soul as something that could wander, something that needed guidance or protection. Perhaps they sang to the dead, told them stories, left gifts so they wouldn't journey alone. We cannot know exactly what they believed, but we can feel the emotion in what they left behind. And in feeling that, we draw close to them, not as relics of a distant past, but as kindred spirits whose concerns were much like ours. They too worried for their children, hoped for good weather, mourned their losses, sought meaning in the stars. They too wondered why things died, why the sun returned, why dreams felt real. Their answers may have been different, but the questions remain the same. In that continuity lies the quiet thread that links us all. And life, though full of hardship, had its moments of joy and wonder. Imagine the thrill of a successful hunt, not just for the food, but for the pride of the tribe. Imagine children playing at the edge of the camp, chasing each other with laughter, inventing games with stones and feathers, mimicking the adults. Imagine a couple walking side by side, sharing silence, their hands brushing in the grass. Imagine the smell of fresh meat roasting, the sound of singing rising into the dusk, the feeling of safety when everyone was gathered close to the fire. These were lives not governed by clocks or contracts, but by presence, by connection, by rhythm. Sleep came with darkness, waking with light. Time wasn't counted in minutes, but in sunrises, in bird migrations, in the changing sense of the earth. There was a slowness to their world that allowed attention, that made space for wonder. A new plant, a strange animal, a shift in the stars. These were not ignored. They were noticed, examined, respected. In some regions, people began to alter the landscape in subtle ways. They burned patches of forest to encourage new growth, attracting grazing animals. They dug into earth for tubers, creating shallow trails. They followed rivers not just for fish, but for the routes they offered across terrain. These were the first signs of stewardship, of shaping the land not through conquest, but through participation. The land provided, but it was also listened to. When rains failed, people moved. When animals vanished, they sought new ways to feed themselves. This responsiveness was a kind of intelligence as important as any invention. It was the intelligence of attunement, of balance, of reciprocity. It required humility and awareness, traits that grew through necessity, but also through time, through stories, through community. And community always was central. No one survived alone. Small bands, perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, formed the core of Paleolithic society. Within these bands were kin, friends, elders, children, each with their role, each with their place. Leadership wasn't about power, but about experience. An elder who remembered where the rivers dried up, who knew the safest caves, who could read the wind. Such a person would be listened to, not obeyed like a king, but respected like a guide. Decisions were likely made together, through discussion, story, memory. Disputes, when they arose, were dangerous, not because of violence, but because of division. To fracture a group was to threaten everyone's survival. And so, reconciliation, understanding, and cooperation were more than virtues. They were lifelines. Over time, gestures became customs, customs became rituals, and rituals became traditions. In these traditions, people found identity, purpose, and belonging. The Paleolithic mind was not empty or dull. It was alive with metaphor, with spirit, with meaning. A bird's cry might be an omen. A dream might carry a message. A stone found in a strange shape might be kept, touched, whispered over. This wasn't superstition. It was a worldview in which everything mattered. Where modern people often separate mind and body, spirit and matter, the people of the Paleolithic lived in a world where those boundaries didn't exist. To them, the world was alive in every breath, every shadow, every sound. It was not just inhabited, it was shared. Trees, rivers, animals, winds, all were kin. All were voices in the great conversation of existence. And so, day by day, the story of Paleolithic humanity continued, not in great leaps of empire or monument, but in the soft and steady rhythm of walking feet, the hum of shared song, the flicker of firelight on familiar faces. Life was a continuous unfolding, marked not by years, but by cycles, of seasons, of migrations, of births and deaths, and the return of birds in spring. They were close to the land, not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, intuitively. The roots of what we now call spirituality were already stretching down into the human heart, born from awe, from gratitude, from fear of the unknown, and love for what was familiar. A beautiful sunrise might be a gift. A successful hunt might require a thank you whispered to the bones. A storm might carry the voice of something greater, and a dream might carry a message from one who had passed. There was likely no formal religion, no temples or priests, but there was reverence, there was respect, there was wonder. To live in such a world was to feel the sacred in everything, not as a separate space, but as the very fabric of life itself. This wasn't organized belief, it was felt experience, the kind that doesn't need doctrine to be real. Children would have been raised into this understanding as naturally as they learned to walk, absorbing it in the gestures of their elders, in the ceremonies of firelight, in the hush that fell when the stars appeared. And in this deep knowing, music and art continued to grow, not as hobbies, but as necessary threads in the fabric of daily life. To carve a bone flute was not just to make a sound. It was to shape the air with intention, to draw song from silence. To paint an animal on the wall of a cave was not merely to decorate. It was to remember, to honor, perhaps even to invite that animal's spirit to return in the hunt. To string beads made of bone or shell was not just to adorn the body. It was to say something about the self, to speak through texture and color, to connect. In a world without mirrors, what you wore might be your message. A tooth from a hunted animal might mark your bravery. A dyed feather might show who you were mourning. A spiral carved into a piece of slate might be a map of memory, or a symbol for something too complex to say aloud. The Paleolithic world was rich not only in survival, but in symbol. Their minds were bursting with imagination, not just of what was, but of what could be. They imagined not only stories and spirits, but possibilities. They refined their tools again and again, finding new ways to attach blades, to bend wood, to shape fire. They began to store things, not just physically, but mentally. Memory itself became a tool, a particular bend in a river, a certain tree struck by lightning, a cluster of stones in the shape of an animal. These became markers, signposts in the great map of the world that existed not on paper, but in the mind. These were landscapes remembered in stories, sung across distances, drawn in the air with the finger, passed from grandparent to child. And so it was that humans spread, step by careful step, into nearly every inhabitable corner of the earth. Each new land brought new challenges, new adaptations. In cold northern forests, they made tailored clothing with bone needles, stitched with care to trap warmth. In open plains, they hunted in teams, using coordinated movement and signal calls. In coastal areas, they fished with spears and nets, learned to read the tides, followed the migration of sea creatures. Their knowledge was local, specific, sacred. It was not general knowledge. It was deep, place-based wisdom, grown from experience, watched with careful eyes, remembered in the body. And from this came survival, not just for one, but for all. The concept of the individual, so prominent in modern life, was different then. Identity was woven into the group. Safety, purpose, and memory were communal. There was no private wealth, no accumulation of power or resources for one alone. What you had, you shared. What you made, you passed along. A kill was not a private trophy. It was food for the whole group. A skill was not hidden. It was taught to the next. Even language itself evolved in this sharing space, shaped by the need for precision and connection, for safety and song. And in the spaces between words, there was silence, not empty, but full. Silence was time to listen, to feel, to look. The sound of leaves in the wind, the crunch of feet on frost, the distant cry of a bird. These were messages to the attentive ear. In that quiet world, attention was survival, and presence was everything. The people of the Paleolithic knew how to be still. They knew how to wait. They knew how to move without panic, and to rest without fear when rest was safe. They slept beneath stars without doors or locks, relying on fire, on one another, and on their deep understanding of the world around them. And as the generations passed, some things stayed the same while others shifted. Ideas moved more slowly than they do today, but they did move. A new tool design might spread from one band to another, carried in the hands of a traveler, taught over a shared fire. A ritual might change slightly as it passed from one region to the next, shaped by different landscapes, different needs. The idea of identity itself began to stretch. People began to carry symbols of their lineage, their group, their place. A certain type of bead, a specific design painted on a rock. A tune sung in a way that only one band knew. These were early signs of culture, of difference, of belonging. There was no nationalism, no borders, no flags, but there was meaning in origin, in journey, in connection. People knew where they came from, even if their home was a trail that moved with the herds. Home was not a structure. It was the people, the memory, the shared fire. And it was this understanding that allowed humanity to thrive across a planet so vast and varied that no one climate, no one terrain could define what it meant to be human. They were not bound to one place, but they were always tied to the land. The land fed them, taught them, challenged them, and in return, they honored it. They did not extract from it endlessly. They lived with it in mutual rhythm. They took only what they needed. They moved when resources thinned. They left space for regrowth, for return. They knew that to take too much was to lose everything. And so they lived lightly, not from ideology, but from necessity and wisdom. Their footprint, both literal and metaphorical, was soft. The earth bore them gently because they treaded gently upon it. And even as they left behind tools and bones, beads and paintings, they did not scar the earth. Their legacy was presence, not ruin. They moved like the wind, like the deer, like the seasons, part of the world, not separate from it. And as time stretched on like the river, winding patiently through the valley, generation after generation of Paleolithic people came and went, their lives woven into the vast unseen tapestry of human memory, each thread distinct, each thread connected. No records remain of their names or faces, but their presence is everywhere, in the stones sharpened by their hands, in the quiet layers of ash where fires once burned, in the shells gathered from distant coasts and carried inland, threaded into necklaces or sewn into clothes. These people didn't build temples from stone, but they built lives filled with meaning, structure, and attention. Their temples were the sky, the cave, the forest clearing at dawn, the place where food was found or a child was born. Their rituals were made from movement and moment, kneeling at a stream, offering a glance to the rising sun, holding silence before a hunt. These gestures, repeated over years and across regions, became something larger than habit. They became culture, not culture written in books, but culture carved into the bones of living. In many places, cave walls still whisper with traces of their dreams. There are lines and animals, symbols and echoes, the slow, deliberate marks of someone reaching beyond necessity and into expression. The caves weren't homes. They were places of story, of mystery, of spirit. In the flickering light of torches made from dry moss and animal fat, the walls came alive, and the figures painted there may have been part of a dance, a ritual, a vision. In these sacred places, the line between the world of waking and the world of meaning blurred. Perhaps only a few were allowed inside. Perhaps children were brought in for the first time during rites of passage. Perhaps these caves were considered wombs of the earth, places where the spirits dwelled, where ancestors spoke through shadow and pigment. To stand in those caves now is to feel something ancient stir inside, as if the breath of those long-gone people still lingers in the cool air. Watching, listening, remembering. The humans of the Paleolithic were not hurried. Their lives moved at the pace of nature, with space for reflection, for stillness. They knew the art of waiting, waiting for herds to arrive, for plants to ripen, for the moon to rise. In that waiting, they found rhythm. Their days were filled with work, yes, but not the kind of relentless toil that modern people often endure. There was effort, but also balance. Time for gathering, for resting, for making, for teaching. The camp was a place of life, of connection, of renewal. Here, elders passed down stories by firelight. Here, children shaped their first tools under watchful eyes. Here, lovers whispered beside embers, and friends shared laughter that echoed into the night. Sleep came naturally, guided by the stars and the lull of crickets and wind. Food was earned, shared, savored. Hunger was common, but not always a crisis. It was familiar, understood, a reminder of the world's rhythms. They didn't expect constant plenty. They expected change, and they adapted. Adaptation was perhaps their greatest strength. Wherever humans went, they found a way to live. Not just to scrape by, but to thrive. In the tundra, they wrapped themselves in furs, hunted reindeer, built homes from snow and bone. In the tropics, they fished and foraged, crafted tools from bamboo and bone, built shelters of palm and vine. In deserts, they tracked scarce water, moved with care, read the stars to find their way across the sand. This adaptability was not just physical, it was mental, social, emotional. They learned from one another, from the land, from experience. They made mistakes, no doubt. They lost people, made bad choices, stumbled into danger. But they learned. They remembered. And that memory became the map they handed forward, generation after generation. A living library, carried in story, gesture, tool, and song. And within that memory, within that continuity, there was always love. Love not as a modern construct, but as a natural extension of survival. To care was to thrive. A mother's embrace, a friend's guidance, an elder's story. These were not luxuries, they were essential. Empathy and cooperation weren't secondary traits. They were survival strategies. A child needed many hands. A sick person needed tending. A hunter needed trust. There was space for competition, surely, but more often, there was care, kindness, the knowledge that the group mattered more than the individual, that when one faltered, the others stepped in. That success wasn't measured in personal gain, but in shared wellness. And from this came joy, not always loud or long-lasting, but present. The joy of a full belly, of a returning herd song, of children laughing, of the fire warming cold toes. Even in struggle, they found beauty. In the pattern of frost, in the arc of a hawk, in the rhythm of footsteps across grass. Their world was not full of things, but it was full of meaning. Their meaning was shaped by space, by sound, by silence. There were no cities buzzing with distraction. There was the breath of the wind, the rustle of leaves, the sigh of a sleeping child. There was time to feel the world, to sit, to watch, to remember. This slowness was not laziness, it was wisdom. A fast world misses things, a slow world notices, and the people of the Paleolithic noticed everything. A shift in animal tracks, a change in cloud shape, a new flower blooming. They were attuned, connected, embedded. They knew that life was fragile, that danger could come swiftly. But they also knew that the world was full of gifts, That fire could be coaxed from stone. That food could be pulled from root. That stories could be carried across time. That love could outlast death. And even as time marched forward and new ideas began to rise, tools more complex, shelters more permanent, the earliest whispers of domestication, the Paleolithic soul remained. It lingered in every spark of curiosity, in every act of creation, in every moment of awe beneath the sky. That soul, the soul of those people, our ancestors, is still within us, in our need for connection, in our love of story, in our yearning for meaning, in our silence before beauty. They were not ancient in spirit, they were simply first. First to walk, first to wonder, first to sing. So now, as the night deepens and your eyes begin to grow heavy, let your thoughts drift gently backward across the vast plains of time, to the long-forgotten campfires glowing softly beneath a starlit sky, where our ancient ancestors once gathered in quiet circles, their voices low and steady, their laughter soft and slow, like water over stone, and the flicker of flame, casting shadows that danced across rough-hewn faces and painted cave walls, whispering memories into the rock itself. Feel the earth beneath you as they felt it, solid, familiar, ancient, its pulse steady and silent, a comfort passed from life to life, and breathe in the cool air of the wild world they knew, where the rustle of leaves and the crack of firewood spoke louder than words, where silence was sacred and stories flowed like rivers from one generation to the next. Imagine them sleeping, curled in fur and nestled in kin, listening to the hum of night insects and distant wolves, the wind brushing through trees as it still does now, unchanged and eternal, and in that silence, sense the slow rhythm of a world before noise, before cities, before the clock, a world at peace with the dark, where dreams stretched far and deep into the mystery of sky and spirit. And know that in this moment of stillness, you are not alone, but gently carried by the same breath that moved them, the same heartbeat that kept them safe and warm beneath the stars. And as you close your eyes now and begin to drift into your own deep sleep, may you find yourself walking softly beside them through ancient valleys and quiet forests, where nothing is urgent, nothing is loud, and everything simply is, calm and endless, like time itself. Thank you for sharing this long, silent journey through the Paleolithic world, and may your dreams be gentle, full of stars and firelight. Good night.